Continuing with our exploration of deep order, today I'm going to talk about the types of organization that emerge in deep order. So last week we had talked about types of leadership, and recall we had arrived at the notion of deep order by considering the implicit order that exists in time and the implicit order that exists in space. In time, the implicit order is fractal and goes through this pattern of development where we see the growth of a seed into a flower, metaphorically speaking, which represents three phases: the physical, the vital, and the mental. And in space, the implicit order is such that behind every point in space there's a fourfold fullness, and we refer to this fourfold fullness as omnipotence, omniscience, omnipresence, and omnicaring. These are big words, and I had talked earlier about what they really mean, but this implicit order in time and space gives rise to this idea of causal wedges that have a very different mechanism by which things get done within them. And one of the models of development that had emerged also in a prior exploration was where we have the underlying fullness, and from there, through time, there is the emergence of an organization that goes through the three phases of development. And as the mental phase proceeds even further, then the underlying aspect that was in space begins to show itself more. So of this fourfold order, there is one aspect of it that flourishes out with that flower over time. Last week when we looked at the types of leadership, we deconstructed this model of development and came up with 7 types of leadership. So the first type was a physical leadership, the second more of a vital leadership, the third a mental leadership, the fourth an integrative leadership, the fifth a more purpose-driven leadership, the sixth a more contextual leadership, so where there's awareness as well of what needs to be done within any particular causal wedge. And then the seventh was a more macro leadership, in which, whereas the contextual is an additive function, here is a multiplicative function, so that within any particular causal wedge there's a much higher degree of consciousness of everything that is happening in terms of development across the entire wedge. Now when we think about organizations, there is a parallel, and for instance we can talk about a physical type of organization, and here for instance the prime principle would be one of maintaining the status quo. So for instance, an organization may believe that what had made it successful will continue to make it successful, so it plays with fixed boundaries, fixed markets, fixed processes, fixed ways of looking at things. When we talk about a vital organization, we have that notion of fixity breaking down and much more assertiveness in different directions, and perhaps that is akin to a more financially driven organization that has as its goals, say, overall revenue or market share or cash flows, regardless of the type of product or market or processes that it really plays with. And then we have more of a mental or a rational organization, and that is an organization that's driven much more by goals and planning. We have an integrative kind of organization, which has characteristics of each of the previous ones and can switch between them based on circumstance. We have the purpose-driven organization, in which some aspect of the fullness underlying development comes to the surface, and in a previous exploration, the birth of force, I had talked about what that looks like and the kind of impact that that can have on a larger playing field. then we may have a contextual organization that uses that basic force that's arisen to advance development across an entire wedge of causality. And this, of course, is much rarer, but I would say that this kind of organization, where there's a basic higher level of flowering implicit at any time-space boundary x in relation to a time-space boundary x minus y, which means that there's a more holistic and imperative development, such that perhaps we're seeing with movements such as corporate responsibility and the green movement and so on. So I'd say that we're kind of tipping into that area, but the only difference is that we don't have it driven in many cases by this purpose or by this deep force that arises. So there's a lot of potential development that needs to take place to really get us there. And then here's the future macro kind of organization in which there's a much larger awareness of everything that's happening and that needs to happen. And I would say that that would probably take on a very, very different form than what we are imagining it might take on right now, and something that we can only barely hypothesize about. So when we map these 7 types of organizations, and I'll use a couple of different scales, but one, of course, is the 7 types of organizations, and the other, let's use effectiveness as one scale, where we have effectiveness increasing along this axis. Then, just as in the case of leadership, I would say that effectiveness increases rapidly as we get to the higher type of organization. The other thing I want to map is incidence. So what's the relative incidence of the kind of organization that exists today? And here, if we think about this as the physical, vital, mental, integrative, purpose-driven, contextual, and a macro, for instance, then we obviously have a much higher incidence of the first 3 kinds of organizations and much lower of the other ones, and almost non-existence of the macro. And so we have incidence in this direction, and we have effectiveness in this direction. Now, what I'll say that this is at a particular time x, let's call it today, but ideally what we want is we want a much higher incidence of the macro organization and the contextual organization and less of the others. So it would be a reverse curve almost, where we would perhaps see a much higher incidence of these kinds of organizations and lower of the physical, vital, mental. So I'll call this curve incidence x plus y. And the opportunity that exists for us in terms of organizational development is clearly called out between this gap between incidence x and incidence x plus y, which points to the great opportunity that we have in terms of how we want to further develop organizations.